Jerusalema ikhaya lami ilondoloze uhambe nami zungangishilana Jerusalema ikhaya lami ilondoloze uhambe nami zungangishilana dawo yami ayikholana buso wami awukholana ilondoloze zuhambe nami dawo.
Good morning, good people. My name is Lindy Shabangu, and we are coming to you from the River Vaal, Gauteng, south of Johannesburg, in South Africa. For the moment, Father Vumile and Father Patrick are busy taking a breath from all the Jerusalem dance, but we're going to be discussing with them about the life and livelihood of Saint Francis. I'm really looking forward to this journey with them today. So, take a journey with me as we go and have a discussion with them. We're back with my two famous friars for the day. Father Vumile, welcome back home to South Africa.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Father, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
For myself? Oh, I thought this is about the book here. Anyway, I am Vumile, as you say, Nogemane, you know. I'm a friar here in South Africa. And the friars then asked me to participate in the study formation of our young friars from almost all parts of Africa, up in Lusaka, which is in Zambia.
Oh,
so
wow.
I'm one of the formators, lecturers there.
Wait, at the university?
Yes, that's right. Our university there.
Okay.
Yes, St. Bonaventure is called, St. Bonaventure University. Not the one in the States in New York now.
The one in Lusaka.
Oh,
Lusaka,
yeah, there's
yes.
a Bonaventures in New York, all right. Yeah, not to be confused. This is the more important one in Lusaka.
Because we are
Yes.
Africans that way.
That's
Right,
it.
okay, yeah.
That's it, yes.
And everybody would know the famous Father Patrick Noonan.
Oh, no.
He is famous for
could-
writing one of the books that actually made history, because he's been living in South Africa and especially in townships. There's one near here called Sharpeville, and he collected all those historical moments and put it in a book, which was also read on SAFM, by the way. They're burning the churches. But today, we're not talking about that. We're actually talking about this book, this saint. And the friars are Franciscan friars. So I'm really looking forward to catching up with them. Father Patrick, we're going to be discussing this book.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about the man, Francis. I mean, he didn't have a wife, he didn't have any kids. He was just an ordinary man, not really ordinary, but a rich man who then turned ordinary. And he, earlier on, I used the greeting, good morning, good people, more like an African greeting to say. Did he consider himself a celebrity of sorts, or who was he and how did it come about?
Yeah, well, he was, even in his lifetime, a sort of celebrity. He became known for holiness, for his Christianity, for reflecting on his life, for being an example, for being young, for joining the army, his own local army. He went in there hoping for fame and renown, and it didn't work. He was imprisoned, had a spiritual change, revolution, and he changed his life, and he's been changing not only Franciscans but the world since, for the last 850 years. We celebrated that centenary recently in the world, 850 years. You mentioned there, good morning, good people. That's an expression he used going into a town called Bajubostone near Greccio, not too far from Assisi. He used that one morning when he came into a town, which suggests that yes, he was some sort of a religious celebrity, because he was addressing crowds like that, which is strange for people don't do that. He did it because he had some relationship with the people. And remember, Poggio Bastone, Greccio, I was just mentioning Greccio there. That's the place where the world first got the crib, the nativity scene. The nativity scene that was first created by Saint Francis. So that was the first Hollywood set, if you like. You know, I mean, that's 850 years before his time. He was creating its sets to stimulate and people's imagination and to help ordinary people, you and me, the farm labourers, to understand the mystery of the incarnation. Am I more or less right there?
Poggio Bastone, yes,
Yeah,
you mentioned it. Poggio Bastone, Greccio, it's not far from Poggio Bastone.
Yeah.
So people might remember the Greccio element because, as he said, of the Christmas, the Nativity crib,
Yeah.
which was not there before.
Yep.
It came with St. Francis,
Yeah.
as he says, 800 years. And one of the interesting things, it's very moving, when you go to Greccio today, you find all these cribs in the church there, the Franciscan church, where Francis created the first crib. They are from all over the world, from Asia, Japan, China, Latin America, from Asia, as mentioned already,
Yeah.
from Africa, of course, from Europe, of course, and they are displayed around there. So that's an event that has never been forgotten, and rightly so, of course.
Yeah.
And he saw goodness in people. Now, just Paddy was saying that the spiritual revolution, absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
He tried, to gain glory and renown by fighting, but as he said very well, he failed. And suppose he was looking for glory, but then he found that glory in goodness. I think that's a very important, in goodness, because God is there for us. He's the good. So he was close to God, and then he saw the goodness in people and in other creatures. As later on it will come up, candle of creatures celebrated again.
Yeah.
And so the greeting comes from that as well. He was, a man of goodness. He saw goodness of God in himself, but in other people as well. So he said, "Good morning, good people."
It's more like an African way of greeting.
Yes. It is, yes.
Yeah,
It is,
yeah,
yes.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
Like the Zulus
The
will say,
culturally-
Sawubona.
Sawubona. Tumela.
See you, Tumela.
See
Yeah,
you.
everybody greets.
Yes.
Everybody, we
Yeah.
see you as
Yes.
as
And
a unit.
In the plural as well, greeting in the,
Yes.
in the plural, yeah.
That's right, yes.
So, the book is trying to discover what's behind this man, what makes him tick, and why is he the only person that we're remembering. One of the few, well, of course, saints are our role models, and we remember saints for centuries. He's sort of pretty big, different, original, creative. He's all those things in many ways together, and discovering who the real Francis is. Actually, great writers, great Franciscan writers, professors in Franciscan universities have been trying to discover this man, since he was alive here among us.
How would you describe your book? It is very much on Francis.
Well, it's. Have you seen that film called
The Passion?
The Passion of the Christ? It's gone around the world in the last 10 or 15 years. It's a very sort of crude, bloody, direct type of film, and if you like that, let me put it this way: if you like the Passion of the Christ, you will like Saint Francis Uncensored. It's a bit direct, and we'll learn as the interview goes on why it is direct and what enabled me to make it, or why I was prompted to make it direct based on my experiences here in Africa. This book on St. Francis, it's for people who know a little bit about St. Francis, who have read up some stuff about St. Francis, and who want to know more, who want to be provoked or challenged. So yes, I'd say it's a challenging book. I don't know, Vermila, what are you thinking? If it challenges or if it, if it makes people think, I hope it does.
I think that's. I think the last point there is, a kind of provoking people to reflect on who Francis is from a different perspective, as you said,
Yeah.
Here in South Africa, we have this township, the squatter camps,
Yeah.
where you were for a long time, and the developed world perhaps doesn't know that, and so their Francis will be different from the Francis you display in the book. But not everybody has got that, and the church is quite institutional, and they would be a bit nervous, as they were indeed with these. There were many groups like that who were trying to live the gospel like Francis, but then they ended up, turning against the church, and so they were also nervous. Francis's spirituality, is it too revolutionary? Is it going to fit in the church? So I would say again, part of this is he had a different vision, and the church leadership, especially in the person of Cardinal Hugolin, who was chaplain of the different religious groups, he had a different vision from Francis. Francis would not have gone for being a minister general, pope, all those, because he was...
Did he end up in minister general?
He was, but because he's the founder, he was the founder. But then he resigned quickly.
He resigned
in
and out.
1221 and gave some other fellow to take over, and he was... So it was, I would say, there were different visions. And again, one of the scholars now, an American lady, I think she's American, Rosalind Brooke, she goes very much into this. There are different visions. Hugolin, who was representing the Pope and the Church, and then Francis on the other hand, the other side. Francis, he wanted just to be a simple man following the gospel, and those who joined him, they would be like that. So you'd never dream of these positions, not becoming minister general or pope, even a priest. And not that he was criticizing them. He was very respectful of them, but he wanted them to do their part, and he was doing his part in his simplicity, and those who followed him, he wanted them to. So he didn't want to be a priest because he respected the priest so much, priesthood. He believed in that. And again, secondly, he just wanted to go the way of humility the whole way. That's those are the little points I wanted to add there.
So what you gentlemen have described is rather very interesting. But what I find quite not getting, or that's really confusing me, is that you mentioned St. Francis as controversial. I mean, is that really a thing? Because I would have just thought that saints are not controversial at all. They just pray, look up to heaven, and then go straight to heaven when they die. And I also wouldn't have thought that Francis was an African man. Look, we're talking about him being a lover of the environment and the lover of pets. I mean, we know in Africa, dogs are not close to our hearts, They're just made to be guard dogs, to look after the family household, not to be a friend of ours and, So how would you describe him?
Well, you mentioned there about Africa.
Yes.
I don't know whether you know this, but St. Francis spent 2 weeks in Africa, according to what we're told. Now, they tell us in the books he went to Egypt. He was in Egypt. They don't mention that Egypt is in Africa. So, I'm not sure how many people realize that St. Francis had a vision of coming to Africa in order to make peace and to, build reconciliation between what they might call, the clash of civilization. But I just want to, in passing, and coming to the question of animals, St. Francis and animals, he was in Africa. He spent some time here. He spent some time negotiating peace between Christianity and Islam. Now, coming to the question of animals, well, look, I was brought up with little pious stories of St. Francis and the animals. The first statues I saw of St. Francis, he inevitably had birds around him, or sheep, or fishes, and he was preaching to them. And I thought, as growing up, that, well, okay, that's nice, but it's not my experience of life. And you know, there was something porcelain about this Francis. There was something statuesque about him, that he wasn't real, he wasn't human, but he liked animals. And then, you know, out here in South Africa, excuse me, ministry in South Africa didn't enhance that vision or that picture of St. Francis, because apart from safari parks and game lodges, pets are not the biggest thing, and not the biggest thing or biggest interest of people and saints. So I had to adjust to that. That was St. Francis only a person preaching to animals where fishes and birds fluttered around him and nestled in his outstretched hands. Of course, there is the Francis with animals, and of course there is the Francis with the gubbio. Remember the wolf of Gubbio. He was a real serial killer. I mean, he was brutal. And then St. Francis comes along and he tames him, quietens him down, transforms his life, changes his outlook, and the people all cheer. And that's terrific, you know. And the Gulf of Gubbio reminds us that we're living in Africa now, the continent of Africa, the original pristine place where animals are so much and so enrich the continent that millions come here, millions of tourists come here, and we've got, you know, St. Francis was what I might call an animal whisperer. Remember that film? What was it called? The Horse Whisperer. Robert Redford. Remember that? Do you remember that? Robert Redford. Oh yeah. He sort of, a horse learns to have a relationship with him, which is unique. Now Francis seems to have had a relationship with animals. That is true. He was able to tame animals. They submitted to him. They listened to him. And you will find in the book my experiences of Africa, where there are plenty of stories told of things that happen in safari parks. Animals sense the interconnectedness of animals and creation and nature. It's so, in many ways, it's so obvious here. It's so pristine in many ways too. And so St. Francis, of course, he had a special relationship with animals and with nature and with creation, which is brought out. And many stories and discoveries between the relationship between animals and human beings are brought out in the book, which only that I'm here in Africa I couldn't have known. So it did and it does enforce, it sort of impressed me, touched me, moved me in many ways to see how nature was here, especially, game parks and places like that. So yes, and there is a great background to St. Francis, blessing pets on the 4th of October all over the world. But sometimes you feel that people think that pets, that's all that St. Francis is. It's more than that. St. Francis was bigger than that.
What's so special about this rogue book? and I mean rogue, book,
Yeah.
will it not be
Yeah.
banned by the church or even the Franciscans themselves? I mean, this is where we get to the heart and soul of who Francis was. What kind of a person was he? What actually made him tick?
Yeah. Well, look, I have to start from another direction. I have to start coming in the back door, not the front door, to get an answer for this question. Because I have to go on to my experience of living in Africa. Because I experienced a huge set of new values, new challenges, new experiences. And I had to, moving out of Western culture into the cultures of Asia or Africa or South America, you've got to let it happen to you. You've got to allow the culture to influence you because, as we well know, God is in all cultures. He needs just to be tapped and brought out, but God is in all cultures. So I found myself in African cultures, and it took me some years to realize it, but I began to realize that, wait a minute, and I had just gone to the Holy Land. And I had gone there in 2000, stayed there for some time, explored the cultures of the Holy Land, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and those places where Christ moved. And those cultures, I listened to them. And then I sort of, bit by bit, I listened to the cultures here. You know something? I found a similarity between African cultures, and the cultures of Jesus Christ. Now, when I discovered that was mind-boggling. And I realized, wow, is that why Christianity is so popular in Africa? Is that why people carry their Bibles so easily with them to church? It speaks to people here. The rural images, the land, the animals, the fields, the wheat that appear in the Bible, all they challenge, they speak to people, as far as I could see, where I was in southern Africa. And it made me realize, wait a minute, I can even contact Christ through local cultures. Now, I know nobody said that before. Maybe they have. I haven't heard about it. But I began to see Christ in local cultures and connecting it up with Middle East cultures, just a few kilometers up the road, and you're in the Middle East, just the place where St. Francis went, and he looked down over Africa when he came to meet El Malik, the Islamic leader. So I began to hesitate about all my assumptions. Coming from Europe, I began to say, wait a minute, there are other ways for feeling. There's other ways of doing things. There's other ways of seeing the Bible, understanding Christ, understanding culture. And so that stirred me. I had to start writing this experience down. I knew if I don't write it down, I'll forget it, and to me it'll be lost. And I decided I want to write these things down, and try to show that I have to realize that I have to be critical about the culture I was brought up in, because I was going into other cultures. The same happens all over the world. So I was Eurocentric when I came here. I had to re-examine that. Of course, this brings up all sorts of other questions. Many theologians outside Europe would talk about European theology, white theology, academic theology. And here we are in contextual theology during the struggle as well as outside the struggle for the freedom of South Africa, and contextual theology and street theology. And all this came showering in, and I had to get it down on paper, and that's what I did. And I applied it to St. Francis because he lived a very contextual way of life, contextual theology. He left his home, we all know that, but he left his culture. and he had to take risks. He went into the culture of the poor, and he had to accept that. Would the poor in their culture accept him? Or was he rich man, poor man, coming in to tell the poor what to do and how to think? He was absorbed by the poor. And I found my experience here, I was being absorbed also by the poor. Why? Because I was living in townships. And I began to sense and feel their culture, the way they did things, the things that make them cry, the things that make them happy, their joys, their happiness, and their pain. And I was, that affected me, and I had to refer that to St. Francis. Why? Because St. Francis did the same. He did. He went out and he lived among the poor. And as I said, did the poor accept him? Well, I don't know. I've never seen. But poor, we have to accept. Do the poor accept us or not? And so that was my experience, living in townships, living in squatter camps, sensitivity, and all those things. It was very humbling. And I felt, wow, Francis also lived this type of life when he left his well-off parents and allowed himself to be absorbed by the values of the poor. And in some of my other books, I talk about these values and how close they are to the values of the Middle East, actually, the poor of the Middle East. And that would mean then how close they are to the values of the farm workers who worked for the landowners. But of course, Jesus worked. He preached to the farm workers around the Sea of Galilee and those places. He was absorbed by the poor, and so I was absorbed by the poor here, and I had to bring these things. I had to bring these things together, And I said, wait a minute, how am I, as a Franciscan, am I going in the right direction? And I had to ask myself how Francis was allowed himself to be absorbed by the values of the poor. And, so nobody else had done what St. Francis had done. Nobody else, other saints, had absorbed what he did and the values of another culture, not the culture of his dad, not the culture of his mum, and not the culture of his brother. And they found it extremely difficult, to do that. But, so there you are. Any missioner, and I speak as a missioner now, a missioner who allows himself to be absorbed by the incoming or the guest culture, he's challenged to be absorbed because Christ is in there, God is in there, working through cultures. Because Francis was extremely creative, and I thought, well, he was a creative guy. He was we have Doctors Without Borders. He was a saint without borders. He was going cross boundaries all the time and exploring new things. I don't think that's maybe recognized sufficiently, the creativity of St. Francis.
But let's talk about him as a person, as an individual. What made him tick? I mean, what did he believe
For me, let's say
in?
something there. What made him tick,
What did he believe in?
Yes, he did. I mean, he as he said earlier on when we were still, outside, Francis, he had a spiritual revolution. And that spiritual revolution, there are those elements. He was a member of the church, Almost everybody in those days was Christian, but unfortunately, it happens also in other, ages, I suppose, including today, perhaps. Nominal. Many people were nominal. So he was also a nominal Catholic, going to church, perhaps, from time to time. But then when he had this spiritual revolution, really, it dawned on him that, he should just live in a radical manner, the gospel. So the gospel, perhaps, is the first thing. He wanted to follow Jesus as he is. Naked, poor. He mentioned earlier on again about the Gratio, the nativity, crib. So he saw Jesus. He loved that Jesus who is simple, humble, poor. You mentioned again poor, in the African townships and squatter camps. He wanted that Jesus, coming from, of course, quite well-to-do family himself. And so he really immersed himself in the beliefs of the church, and he says in his rule, anyone who wants to join this way of life, that he founded himself and the early companions, he says, number one, they must be Catholic. Now, perhaps we are thinking of the Catholic Church in the institution, but more a life of Catholicism, universal, embracing everybody, like he mentioned again earlier on about the Muslim world, and the lepers as well. Those were, they were not wanted. Nobody wanted to come near them. In fact, they were fighting them.
That was the big experience, the leper experience.
The leper
changed
experience,
everything.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
So all those, tenets of the church, then the teachings, the Blessed Sacrament, you said, Eucharist, Mary, the cross, and so on. But I wanted to add, to what he said earlier on, if you don't mind. You mentioned about the values of, the gospel, in the land of Jesus, the values of the poor in the African squatter camps, slums, whatever you call them, the poor, those values. Now, in John Vaughan is an American original. I'm not sure if he's still alive. He was the Minister General of the Order for many years. That is 1979 to 1991. And during his time, the leadership of the order in Rome, that's why he is the Minister General, they issued this statement, just ties up with what he was saying earlier on. They issued this statement, which is entitled The Call of Africa. Call of Africa. Basically, they were campaigning, calling for all the world, Franciscan world, to come out to Africa in big numbers. And that statement is very beautifully done, It goes something like this, and I must, kind of think it in my head. It says that up till now, Francis of Assisi has been interpreted in terms of exclusively the Western culture. This is 1982 they were writing. Up till now, St. Francis of Assisi has been interpreted exclusively in terms of the Western world, especially Italy, Assisi, where he's from, of course. And then they go on. We are confident, in this note, in this document, we are confident that the values of Africa, the life of Africa, and the religious values can teach us a great deal in the insights like simplicity, humility, joy, prayer, poverty, and so on. And that is the part of the invitation of the Minister General, calling upon Europeans mainly, but Americans too, from the West, to come to Africa. And then they established, presence in Africa in a more aggressive way. For instance, they founded the province nowadays of East Africa, which is made up of about 11 countries, based in Nairobi. So what Father Ped is saying there, that he was evangelized, he was converted, whatever word you want to use, he was moved by the values of the townships in South Africa. That's also in that statement. We are confident, they say, that the African values of life and religion or spiritual values, they can teach us a great deal, we as Europeans and Westerns. So that's, I thought that was tying up with what you said. But also another point, that comes to my mind about who Francis is, what made him. The background again is, remember the church, it has undergone reforms, the church too, And like the most recent one, huge one, was the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 65. But also before Francis, in 1153, there is what we call the Roman Synod. The Roman Synod now is identifying certain corruption in the church, if I may put it, certain elements of corruption, like simony. In other words, the church, the priests were selling the sacraments, the money, simony is called simony. The money was the thing in the church. So the priests were just saying mass, just looking for money, money, money. And the bishops were involved with the land. You know, they were taxing the people on the land. So to be a bishop was power because of the land and money again. And then the popes as well. The popes were fighting with the emperors, you know. So this is a kind of scandal, you know, corruption in the church. And so this Roman Synod in 1153, it called for the church to go back to the apostolic times. And by living the apostolic life, like we see in the Acts of the Apostles, says, for instance, in chapter 2 and chapter 4, in the Acts of the Apostles, the group of believers were united heart and soul. And they were praying together, breaking the bread, celebrating the Eucharist, and none of them was in want. They were not poor. So they were simple brothers and sisters living together. So the 1153 Synod of Rome wanted to go back to that kind of life in the church, which had been lost for those years, you know, 1,000 years. Now, Francis of Assisi then, he took this seriously. Okay, there were other interpretations by the monastic life, for instance, the monks. They said the apostolic life is to live like the monks, and then the hermits claimed it and so on. But interesting, Francis comes from a lay background. He mentioned earlier on he didn't want to be a priest. He was not a priest. There was a lay movement in the church. But some of these lay groups now, there are many of them, Umiliati, the Albigenses, the Cathari. They began nicely, quite well, within the church. But then when the church, they saw that the church didn't favor their way of doing it, as time went on, they kind of, you know, went away from the church and they were criticizing the church, you know, negatively. Francis of Assisi, he didn't want to do that. He wanted to live like them, poor, simple, following Jesus Christ, but within the church. So he's a man who wanted to be within the church. So the church was very central to him. And as he mentioned earlier on again, he had, a lot to criticize in the church, you know, saying these bishops are just looking for money and these priests are not educated. Because again, you know, people were ordained, you know, 18-year-old boy because your uncle is a bishop or cardinal. So there was corruption in the church. And Francis knows that. He's not a stupid man. He sees that. But he is very humble and he wants to revolutionize the church from another point of view, not to criticize, you know, to obey it in spite of that, because as he mentioned earlier on, he believed that it is Jesus, even in these sinful human beings, the bishops and popes, but it is Jesus who was. So those are the points I wanted to add.
Yeah, Francis, he tended to live a parallel life to the church, the way he thought God was calling him, you know. And he knew the corruption was there, but he never got the placards. He never went out with the placards and did the protest.
Never did the toy-toy.
He didn't do the toy so much, you know. He just did the right thing, and people began to notice, he's so holy, so good. They made their own decision. He's right. He's right. You don't need a protest like that. He just did the right thing. For example, you know, going to North Africa, he just did it his way. Like, I don't know, that song there, Frank Sinatra.
He did it my way.
He did it my way. There you go. He did it my way. Well, Francis did it his way, very much. And that's what makes him remembered for hundreds of. He did spirituality. He did holiness his way. You know, I don't know whether that makes sense, but
no, it does really make sense, because it's actually talking about the humility, about you know, the safety elements, about the unity, which is so much, as I see it, so much part and parcel of what makes the Franciscans' life. The communion,
communion and community,
the communion and community of the friars and of the poor clares as well. You're always together. You're always striving for that sisterhood, that brotherhood.
And we can blame St. Francis for that.
This is in spite of the differences there, yes.
In spite of the differences there, yeah. You were mentioning, you know, the corruptions in the church. Of course, there was always corruptions. That is why God, in a sense, parachutes a saint in to sort things out. You know, a saint, he raises up a saint like St. Francis. He raised up St. Dominic, St. Bernard of Siena, St. Catherine of Siena. He raised up people in times of need That's why the church is so, it's so sort of, in other ways, so authentic, coming from the time of the apostles, Francis, God was raised up. Every now and again, a saint appears and brings things back. Because the church is a totally human organization, I won't say it's like a football club, but I mean, it is a human-run organization, and the humans can make dastardly mistakes, and they can do stupid things, and say stupid things, and lead stupid lives. But God has a way of sending in saints to sort things out again, right through history to the present time, So that's to me, that's amazing.
So I gather this then is a good book in our day, in our lives now, where we're talking about Black Lives Matter, where we're talking about refugees. So it is right at this prominent time that we're living in. But then let me take a step back, Father Patrick. Let me ask you. We're talking about you falling in love, if we can put it that way in inverted commas, falling in love with St. Francis. I mean, when you did your research, you would have found out that he was not only a European man, but he did come to Africa. Like you said earlier, that he's a man that came to Egypt, and Egypt is in Africa. And you wanted to embrace and expand your knowledge, but also embrace his humility, embrace the way of life. So tell us your background. Where do you come from?
Yeah, well, just before going on to that, I want to, touch on some basic things about St. Francis also, over and above what we've mentioned. The things that made him tick, it simply wasn't traveling. It wasn't doing things. It was also what he was, and privately what he was. He was a man of incredible prayer. You'd find him out in the fields, in caves. He spent nearly more than half of the year in prayer and fasting. Now, most people don't know that. That's not the St. Francis, preaching to the birds. That's the St. Francis in a cave on the mountains in Italy, praying for hours. Fasting for 2/3 of the year. We don't hear about that very much. He's a saint who was intoxicated by the unity of the Blessed Trinity. Now, you won't hear about that too often. He was the greatest, possibly one of the greatest praise singers. And we'll understand that African word. He was a praise singer of Mary, the Mother of God. He was a praise singer. He was charismatic the way he praised. Isn't that right? The praises of Mary that we say we pray on Saturday morning. These are, if you like, the secret holy life of St. Francis. He wasn't just a public figure. No, he had a secret life that was terrible. It was often very private, but the Eucharist, devotion to the cross, the death of Jesus. I mean, the cross speaks to him twice in his life. Hey, that's big stuff. Isn't that right? I mean, Damiano and on Mount Alverna, this cross comes out of the sky and gives him the wounds of Christ. Well, I mean, that wasn't a public event. Some of the chaps were there with him, weren't they? Some of the brothers who were with him on Mount when he went up to
Leo.
Was it Leo that day? Yeah. This is the private life that made Saint Francis tick. He had his private devotions, private prayer life, private meditation, and he liked spaces in the open to pray and to commune with God, and to commune, of course, with nature.
What is expected of us? What should we do? We should defend our country in the best possible manner.
I'm the governor of the county jail.
I know we're not talking about they're burning the churches. We're focusing on St. Francis Uncensored. But what I'd like to find out was your influence in the 80s. I mean, that should have molded you to actually also have an input in writing this particular book.
Yeah.
So tell us about the 80s.
Yeah, that's very true, Lindy. They were, of course, life-changing times. Once again, above and beyond what I've already said. It was the time when there was total lockdown. This is the last 10 years of apartheid. It's the final uprisings against apartheid took place in this area where we are now, in the townships such as, Sharpeville and Sibuk. These the final uprisings took place here. We, as priests and clergy, found ourselves in the epicenter of everything. So we had to, strategize. And we even formed, clergy solidarity groups. And we had to strategize, as I said, and influence. We had to ask ourselves, here there's potential for huge violence in the transition from apartheid to peace, to new democracy. And there was potential for revolutionary struggle. But I have to say, thanks to the churches and the influence of the churches, it was a relatively peaceful transition from the past to the present democratic state. And that was due to, Archbishop Tutu, we've all heard about him, and also Archbishop Hurley, and also the role of the clergy in change. But our towns were invaded by the South African Army and the South African police, and all sorts of things happened. This is well recorded on the TVs of the world, the televisions of the world. The world saw this happening in the 80s, but we're not going to dwell on that. However, it did influence me, and we talk about Black Lives Matter. Well, Black Lives mattered in South Africa, not just for 45 years, but Black Lives Matter for 300 years of colonialism. Black Lives Matter in all over Africa, and Asian lives matter too. We had actual lockdown, or what was the other way for saying it? Lockdown or shutdown or lockdown here before the world knew what the word meant. We had lockdown when the army seized and immobilized and froze the townships for weeks on end. We were confined to homes, and you daren't go on the streets. So we did have a shutdown and lockdown in the 80s, and it wasn't called that. That word came in more recently. But we had to do what we called crisis ministry. We had to reinvent our apostolates. We had to, think new things and creative ways for evangelization. Because what we did not appear on the manuals, our training manuals. We had to think above and beyond, outside the borders or outside the limits. But shootings every day, killings every day. I had to count bodies. That was one of my jobs, was counting bodies and make sure the parents heard about it, make sure it was documented, and make sure we monitored the police and the police monitored us. It was weird, and it was surreal. Many times for the last 10 years of apartheid, 1984 to 1994, when Mandela was released. But my St. Francis in the book also was influenced, and it is influenced by those experiences. They were life-changing experiences for us, the clergy, for us, the Franciscans. They were life-changing, and we had to take stock of things. A new life was, after you've been traumatized by violence, and that it pushed me to think about St. Francis. St. Francis, I reflected, had also been in 2 wars. I had never been told it like that. I reflected, he too had been in the Peruvian War, and he had gone to war in North Africa, in Egypt. And that struck me, wow, he had experienced such violence. He had experienced such killings, such slaughters. He had experienced being living in a wartime dungeon in Perugia, and so he had seen violence. Maybe he killed some people. We had seen violence too here, but I began to connect these 2 things. Wow! So there is some other connection between our experience here and Saint Francis. We had experienced the other side of his life before the conversion, and that was life changing for me. And I felt, get it down, write it down. Somebody, someplace might be interested, because I was only simply recording what Francis had gone through and what we had experienced here during the final years of apartheid. So I don't know whether that makes any sense, does it?
It does.
Am I still on track?
It's quite interesting.
Yeah. But just before we go back to this question, I was talking about Francis' experience of violence in his early life, although he did some mediating and reconciling in his later life. His early life, he had experienced war. And I was just wondering, is that why, because of his experience of war, was that why he said to his followers that they should not carry weapons? That was one of his things, one of his messages to his followers, that they shouldn't carry weapons. And I was, when I was writing that, I was wondering, what about the American gun lobby?
Oy.
What a message Francis would have for the American gun lobby, or what is it, the NP, or whatever they call it, in the United States, because guns is such a big issue. Everybody has guns. Everybody, they're cowboys almost.
Yeah.
And the West is not one yet. Never mind. But yes, films, and I felt, I had this feeling about Francis. Okay, I had seen the films on St. Francis. I had seen many books, or written them, read many books on St. Francis. And I felt when I was composing my St. Francis that he wasn't just to be only the St. Francis of films or movies, the St. Francis, the St. Francis of the artists.
Of the entertainment.
Yeah. He wasn't just the property of painter, because there's so many marvelous paintings of St. Francis for centuries, especially in Giotto in Assisi. He's not just the stained glass image from the past, and he's not just the property of poets and biographers. But I wanted to bring St. Francis to be a person of the people, a person on the street, to take him out of the windows and give him back to people. A Francis that is alive and breathing, that people on the street could reach out and touch.
Yes, that biography that you gave to me on Pope Francis by Paul Henn, he says one chapter is entitled "The Pope, Bishop of the Slums."
Oh,
Buenos Aires,
Bishop. Oh,
Buenos
right.
Aires.
Okay. Okay, Bishop of the Slums. Well, that says it all.
Argentina.
Argentina. The Bishop of the Slums, and he's familiar with the culture of the slums. I had to be introduced to the culture of the slums, but he was familiar with it already. Yeah.
Friars, tell me. Maybe let's start with you, Father Paddy. St. Francis, did he have any political views?
Well, I don't know. He had views on corruption. I don't know whether there were political parties in Assisi at the time. He was alive, but he had views on corruption. He wasn't afraid to, write letters to political leaders, right? to political leaders. I mean, even today, political leaders, they love to pray St. Francis' prayer for peace. A second thing political leaders love, this is not St. Francis, they love quoting Romans 13. And can you believe, Romans 13, advising people to obey their leaders, their political leaders. You see, Paul used to do that. He used, good political leaders, proper political leaders, not to abide or obey corrupt political leaders. But St. Paul did that. He did write that. And from that time, it's 2,000 years ago, it's from that time political leaders have been quoting, Romans 13. And could you believe it? During apartheid, it was used to by the apartheid government. They used to send Romans 13. I used to see it on the streets, newspapers, in 4 local languages. Romans 13, telling the people, obey your leaders. So political leaders have always been using Christian, or they love to use and quote the Bible for their purposes. Now, St. Francis, yes, he did. He wasn't a member of a political party. He wasn't he didn't go on political campaigns, but when he saw corruption, he spoke. You mentioned sometime Revo Torto. There's some examples there. Would you like to say something about that? Yeah.
There's just examples, yes.
Yeah,
just to add to what you say. When they were in Revo Torto, which is, of course, the very primary, simple structures of the beginnings of the order. There were 12 of them in those days. It was just new movement. So they lived in this very, very poor, run-down structure. It's not even a house, little hut. And then there were news that the great Emperor Frederick was around. And of course, it was a very pompous occasion, and people were flocking around him, and, a great show. And then Francis sent 2 of his sons, spiritual sons. He said, go and tell that man that the kingdom of this world is not going to last. So just pricking his conscience.
Is that
but
politics?
He must remember.
Yeah.
Must remember that, the main thing, he's on top there, yes, but he must look after the people, not about himself. Then another point I'd like to mention here is, as you said yourself, he wrote to the rulers of the world. We still have those letters. He wrote to the rulers of the world, and basically again reminding them that their power is from above, is given to them, and secondly is to look after the people, especially of course the simple poor people, ordinary people who have got no power, like the rich and so on. And then another final one I would like to refer to is when he was on his deathbed, and they were praying and singing Canticle of Creatures, famous, world-renowned song, Canticle of Creatures of Francis. Be praised, my Lord, for all your creatures, for brother, son, and so on. Then news came that the mayor of Assisi, his own town, and the bishop, because bishops in those days, there's a lot of power, politically too. So they were fighting again, of course, it was over power. And Francis then sent the brothers to go and sing. He added another stanza.
Now he was different,
He added another stanza to his Canticle of Creatures and says, be blessed all those who embrace one another in spite of the differences among them, those who work for peace. So he was a reconciler. He was a reconciler in time of need like that, So that would be his politics, kind of, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, that if that was politics, then he was involved in politics,
So
advising leaders.
And what about the markets, though?
Assisi as well, didn't he? Send letters to the authorities in Assisi. Oh no, was it to world leaders?
World leaders, yes.
He wrote letters to. I mean, how many saints have written letters to world leaders? Well, maybe Catherine of Siena, maybe Bernadette. What?
Catherine of Siena, she wrote yes to the Pope and so on.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Francis is about the only one, as far as I know.
Is that right? Yeah. So that's sort of another thing that's unique about him, that he would take them on, write to them, and even to the top guy. I mean, the guy you mentioned there, Frederick Barbarossa.
Frederick Barbarossa.
I mean, you didn't go near him. You couldn't go near him. But Francis did, as a humble, very humble, modest person, and said, go up there and tell that guy passing by, you know, the Prime Minister. It's like going up to the Prime Minister and telling him off, you know.
But what about the fighting that was happening during the time that drove the markets? I mean, there were clashes during those times.
Yeah. I mean, look at that. You know, it brings you onto the times of St. Francis. I mean, what was happening on the streets of Assisi? Who, you know, what were the cults? The Albigensians. What was happening there? Who were the trendsetters in Assisi at the time? Who were the political parties? You know, all that type of stuff. What were the popes doing? What was their problems? You know, he's in the middle of that. It was, I would say, a game of, you know, this thing on the television. You've all heard about it, the Game of Thrones.
Yes.
Did you ever? You heard of it? Did you? Oh,
Yes.
You would. Well, look, the world in St. Francis' time was a Game of Thrones. Family fights, leadership fights, clan fights, tribal fights, and you know, it was a Game of Thrones in medieval times. I wouldn't be surprised if Game of Thrones is based on it. On Assisi or some of those things that have with a certain amount of exaggeration and the way they depicted things. But yeah, that was the life and times of St. Francis, and a Game of Thrones. That's what drew him out, apart altogether from his private personal devotion to God and his personal relationship with Mary and Jesus, and of course receiving the wounds of Christ on his body. He was also called out. You know those places he was called out to deliver people, to make peace, to reconcile. You know, people called a place called Arezzo and Bologna, and there's some other places that I had mentioned. There's some place there. He was called out, and he did reconciliation work. He did peace building. He did a lot of, going on journeys from one place to, there's about at least recorded 3 or 4 towns in Italy that he went to reconcile families, clans and tribes. Now that was a ministry, you know, Lindy, that was a ministry. Was that politics? I don't know what you can call it, politics if you like, but he was peacemaking. Where at the cold face of where the war was at, where people were fighting, he wasn't afraid to go in there and appeal to them, to their better senses, to have a sense of reconciliation, that there's more things to fighting in life than, you know, cutting the head off your brother or sister or whatever. The family, you know, it was quite ruthless and bloody at the time. No wonder everybody at the time wore weapons and swords and daggers and knives and all that to protect themselves. I guess there were very violent times that Francis was living in.
They were indeed. I mean, you referred to it earlier on. We talked about it. Remember, Assisi and Perugia, they were fighting, and it was basically the rich, the nobles, and we mentioned about Claire. You remember, she's the first woman to follow him. You know, she joined in 1212, and Francis began 1209. So 3 years later, the first woman comes, and Claire, was, you know, from a noble family, very rich.
Yep.
And the rich families were thrown out of Assisi because the minores, the poor ones, they were fighting the rich. They were looking for their rights, you know. They were looking for their rights. So the rich moved over to Perugia, which was a city for the rich. They went there. And so those are the times. And Francis then, he opted for the poor. He himself, from the middle class, he went to the minores, they were called, the poor ones. And, you know, his life is just oriented on that. The poor, the poor, the poor. So that's part of it. And then also, I mean, within the church too, as he mentioned earlier on, again, you know, it's Cardinal taking the crusades to the Muslims, you know. And Francis was there. That's another, in his book now, this book, about the Muslims and the Christians. And Francis says, no, they are our brothers too. And the cardinal said, "You are mad," because he was standing for the Pope. The church was going to kill the Muslims, and the Muslims were killing the Christians. Francis went there. And then finally, what I remember, finally then again, you mentioned it before, Francis said to all his followers, the secular Franciscans, those in the world, those in the families, the secular Franciscans, no carrying of arms. He said no carrying of arms, no fight. And that was also a problem because the civil authorities now, they had no young men to join their armies, but that brought peace. It brought peace. Francis said no carrying of arms. And, so he was very much, if you want, taking sides then, taking sides for peace. Peace, yes. He was there.
But what, I mean, I've gone through the book. What intrigues me is this question about Francis and Islamic community, Islamic people. There are stories that Franciscans have traveled and they have been martyred and killed by Muslim people. But Francis himself goes into the Muslim territory, speaks peace, comes out alive. How would you reconcile Francis and Islam?
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was so creative that he took a completely different stand than the church at the time. The church was sending crusades. It was the way things were done. Fifth Crusade. And I think there was some teaching there that you get an indulgence for killing a Muslim. Malicide, you get, if you were killing a Muslim, you kill they were a threat to the sort of the Western world or the Christian world. That's the way they were seen. Now Francis, in an extraordinarily creative way, leaves the order in Italy, and it must have taken 2 or 3 months to find his way to North Africa, to Egypt, and then walks. There's a war on, a battle on, and he walks through the battling lions, walks through them, across no man's land, and gets into having a 2-week chat with the head of the Muslim army. Now, there's some things to be understood here. The Muslim army head, he possibly was a member of what's called the Sufi branch. I'm not absolutely sure that he could be, because he tended to be a wise man too, who actually probably wanted peace, but he was under pressure. Some people say, why didn't Francis convert him? If he converted, he would have been killed immediately by all the generals around him. They couldn't have handled that at all. So it wouldn't have been a good strategy to convert to Christianity there and then, and facing an army of 10,000 or 15,000 outside, and tell them all, hey guys, I'm a Christian now. I don't think you would have lasted very long, I'd tell them I've given you a new general here. So, but this is what I like to see Francis when he came to Africa, you see, and he got a sense of Africa, a smell of Africa, the heat of Africa, the sun of Africa, and he met this Muslim leader, armies. He defied almost, I suppose, the Vatican. Defied almost Cardinal Pelagius. He didn't what he was up to, but as we said earlier, good morning, good people. Francis was becoming well known at this stage, and he's only about 40 years of age, or 42 years of age, and he's wielding this type of simple, humble prestige almost. They're almost nervous of him, and he goes over and spends 2 weeks with the Muslim the general there, and. When I was writing that, the thought came to my head during the final years, months of apartheid. Here, we had to have peace meetings with the apartheid police, army, and security branch. And we, clergy and trade unions, we'd come together around a big table in Vereeniging. And there was all the opposition there. Police, army, generals. The epaulets were magnificent. The colour was terrific. The buttons were all shining, you know. And here we were, the clergy and the trade unions, you know, and they glared at us. We tried to have peaceful faces like St. Francis, exuding peace.
Right.
And they'd look over at us, and they'd see me, the only white among the blacks. And I could read what was happening in their minds. Betrayer. He's betrayed us. You know, I could see it. I could see their eyes squinting and asking, who is this guy? You know, and we'd have these negotiations. There were peace negotiations. I used that experience when I was writing the book about St. Francis with the other guys to explain what are the feelings of being in top negotiations. What are how do you glare at one another, or how do you look at one another? How do you look at the body language of the people across from you? You know, and that I used that experience of the negotiations here in South Africa to explain, or in some way to enhance, or maybe influence, or try to show what it was like for St. Francis to be sitting down for 2 weeks with the Muslim leader. Now, you know, so he possibly was a Sufi, and he did have wisdom, and he did actually want peace. The Muslim did it, according to what we hear by the experts these times. And so that adds more to what St. Francis did, but has not been recognised maybe for 800 years. And it just, I don't know, it reminds me of an experience I had in Johannesburg. I hope I'm not jumping ahead too much, but I mean, look, Islam and Christianity, they're controversial subjects. There's so much written about them. There's so much on YouTube about them. Debates, Islamic dress, controversy, right-wing Christians. It's a whole big thing. We're not going to get into it now. It's too big, you know. But the one I'd like to emphasize is St. Francis and Islam, which has been taken up by the present Pope as a cue for the future of the world. And why we mightn't realize it, or maybe the majority of the world, most people don't realize it, but there's big things happening. And the Pope works very much with symbolic actions. And that's why he has, for example, he went to the Middle East, the United Arab Emirates. He went to Morocco, the Emirates, to meet I think it's the Shiites. No, the Sunnis, I think. Yeah, they're Sunnis over that side. And then he went, of course, there a few weeks ago to Iraq to meet the Shiites, and now that's been a huge impact in the Islamic world today, and the Pope is simply following his model, his role model,
The example of St. Francis.
Yeah, he's simply following that. He's talking about the fraternity or the brotherhood and sisterhood of humanity. He's trying to say that, you know, I mean, okay, the Abrahamic faiths, and you've got the Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians, they all acknowledge Abraham. And isn't it interesting that the Pope visited the Abraham's site, or his burial place, was it?
Yes, in Iraq, yes.
In Iraq,
yes,
a few weeks ago. And that was hugely symbolic when it went all over the world. And it was amazing to see Iraq, big hoardings of the Pope and the Ayatollah in the same picture. And that said so much to so many million Muslims. Just the big picture of the Pope together with that. That was extraordinary, you know. So, I bring it out in the book that this is big stuff. Francis, I mean, he learned so much from the Muslims. He brought so much back from the Muslims. Was it the Angelus, or was it
yes.
the name, the 90 names of God or something. The Angelus, was it? You know some of that.
Yes.
What he learned from the Muslims. He actually learned prayer from the Muslims. He couldn't believe it. They're fighting a war and they're down for prayer 5 times a day. Maybe they maybe they had a dispensation if there was a war on, I'm not sure. But I mean, he saw prayer among the Muslims. He brought that back, didn't he? Yeah.
That kind of tradition, yes. Yeah. But yes, still on that, going to the Muslims there, so there's 2 factors there, if I may say.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have got St. Francis, who, as we said earlier on when we started off with this whole, interview, you said he was a man with a basic goodness. He saw goodness in other people. So that's part of it, his meeting with the Muslims. He saw them as brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
So, and they said, I think you mentioned it earlier on again, just now, that, while the church officially was fighting the Muslims and the other way around, Francis said, they are our brothers. He went out there and they recognized that. They said, there's a Christian. Oh, but, he's a different Christian. Doesn't bring any gun or anything, he's coming very humble. And, they welcomed him. So it was both sides. You say this, this Islamic leader was a man of peace,
Malik.
filling this, the Sufi section.
Possibly they were Sufi, And that was the
So
time
both sides,
where this famous Islamic philosopher and poet, Rumi,
Mm-hmm.
he was living at the same time as St. Francis, and apparently admired St. Francis, but never met him, because St. Francis was already in North Africa, in Egypt, so they didn't meet. But there are Muslim brothers and sisters who acknowledge and even like to call Francis their man too.
Yes.
There is that too.
Yes.
And this is an extraordinary thing. And when there was negotiations held in Rome in the Antoniana one time, the Dirges, I think, so this Islamic group were invited from Turkey to the Antoniana to do some of the Islamic dances associated with the Sufi group.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think there's a place in Turkey called Konya. That's where Rumi is buried, and people go there. Pilgrims go there even to today, and and there's a lot of good influence from there about interreligious dialogue from the teachings of Rumi and that group of Muslims today, where he was. They have moved. They're even in Johannesburg. I was invited to them. They espouse dialogue. They espouse peacemaking. They espouse non-violence, and they're very open to Christians to meet them and socialize with them and pray with them. I was there and invited into their mosque there a few years ago, and I gave them. I think. Oh yeah, we had viewed the book, this new film on St. Francis called The Sultan and the Saint. The Sultan and the Saint. We had just viewed that in an Islamic group and myself, and I was wearing the habit. Of course, I explained the habit. It's the same on our friars in the United States. They were the advisors to this film, and I told them, did you notice St. Francis was wearing this in the film? So we had a laugh, we had a joke, and they gave me the works of Rumi, and I gave them the works. I gave them what? This.
Good.
Because I think they copied this for the film. Oh, I suspect they did. But I think they got it before that. They didn't tell me. They didn't admit it. That's all right.
Okay, they didn't tell you.
But I think we probably have jumped ahead.
No, you haven't.
We've jumped ahead a bit in the discussion, huh? We jumped about. I think we jumped about 2 or 3 questions that we wanted to ask.
The combination, anyway.
Yeah.
We did indeed,
Yeah.
and which is beautiful.
I think so too.
Because
This
it's just
connection.
getting into
It's-
the heart
Yeah.
of who the man was,
Yeah.
and also the inspiration that you got from living in Africa, from living
Combining
not only in
everything.
the south of Africa but in the north of Africa as well, and bringing that
Yeah.
into the life of the man that you are emulating.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway,
Well, if I
we
had
need to be told
if
some
I
things.
had to start, I'd start by saying, was Claire, the poor Claire, a feminist? But that is a discussion for another time.
No,
Let's
she was a religious feminist. One of the early religious feminists in the world. She was. She didn't take no for an
She'll
answer.
start.
I mean,
He'll start.
oh yeah.
Don't provoke this man.
Claire was a tough nut and so gentle. Tough and gentle.
Humble.
Humble as
A
well.
jungle tough.
Yeah.
But
A
she
jungle
wasn't-
tough nut.
She took on the Pope, believe it or not.
Okay, I think that's another discussion for
Okay,
another
all right,
day.
okay, all right.
Next
In
time.
conclusion, I think this has been insightful for me, and I've learned quite a bit. What interests me, maybe it's because I am from Africa and I love my roots. I love the aspect that he was impacted by Africa. And not just South Africa, but just Africa as a whole. So I love that aspect, and I think it's about time that the globe understands and hears that aspect of Saint Francis.
Oh,